Thank you for tuning into We Believe Digital. We are designed to inspire. You are now tuning into the Soil Conservation Connection.
Hello, and welcome back to the Soil Conservation Connection. I'm your host, Deidre Perry, and we are here in the We Believe Digital Podcast Studios in Jackson, Mississippi, and we are so glad that you took time to join us. So if you're a newbie here, we're talking all things soil conservation. If you're a returning guest, thank you so much, and hopefully you caught the last two episodes, which were on composting, and we're still going to be talking about composting even on today. So on the last two episodes, we talked about the definition of composting, and just a simple definition of composting is just the process or the controlled process of decomposing organic material. So that's just the basic definition, is that it is a controlled process for decomposing organic materials. Not only did we learn the definition in an expanded form on the previous episodes, but we also talked about what you would need to compost. You don't need a lot. There's ways you can even DIY composting bins, but there is a supply list that'll help you be prepared should you decide to take on the composting challenge. As well, we talked about what you can and cannot compost. Everything cannot be composted. And so if you want to learn about that, those things that you can and cannot compost, check out the videos that we produced over the last couple of weeks. Now on today, we're going to talk about hot versus cold. Feeling hot, hot, hot. I knew about hot composting, but I did not know that there was cold composting. So we're going to learn about the composting process, the time it takes to compost, what you need to be looking for, the difference between hot and cold, and when you would utilize either one of those methods, and so much more. This podcast is brought to you by USDA. It is produced by New South Development and Training and hosted right here in the We Believe Podcast Studios in Jackson, Mississippi. I can't wait to come back so we can jump into some more things on composting, all things composting, right here on the Soil Conservation Connection. We'll be right back after this.
Have you had your Earth Blend coffee today? At Earth Blend Coffee, we take pride in offering you the very best of beans across the world, blended and roasted to perfection, giving you superior quality and satisfying and flavorful taste. Experience the world in one cup with Earth Blend Coffee. To order, visit earthblendcoffee.co now.
Welcome back. I hope you liked that quick commercial exposing you to Earth Blend Coffee, or educating you on Earth Blend Coffee. It's some really good stuff. If you want some really good coffee, go over to earthblendcoffee.co. So as I told you before we went for the break, we are going to be talking about the composting process and timeline. So we're going to go through hot versus cold. We're going to talk about the size of your composting piles, how long it takes, and what you should be doing. So we talked about composting being the process by which we decompose organic materials. We went over that your composting materials, the things that you can compost, should be of your greens and browns. And greens would be your grass clippings, coffee grounds, since we just got through watching the Earth Blend Coffee commercial, fruit and vegetable scraps, fresh garden trimmings, those things, that would be your green materials. Your brown materials, which are carbon rich, the greens are nitrogen rich. The brown materials are carbon rich, and that would include stuff like dry leaves, cardboard, paper, sawdust, untreated wood. So those would be like the things that you can and you would want to compost. What you should not compost, meat, fish, dairy, because when you're trying to compost those things, I know some people will compost fish, and it does make some really good fertilizer. However, in compost piles, it really can create smell and pest issues. So in general, when we were talking about dispelling the myths that, oh, it's too smelly, well, it can produce a smell, but not as bad as one would think. If you smelled dirt before, it's smelling like dirt. But when you start composting things like fish and meats and things like that, they develop a really foul odor and they bring more pests. So we don't want to do that. Oil or greasy foods, diseased plants. And I was guilty of this when I first started composting. one of the things I would do in the garden, the community garden, if I had plants that were not developing or looked like they were rotting, I would pull them up and throw them in my compost bin. And that did not help because those diseased plants only took the disease and placed it in the composting soil. Chemically treated wood or paper, because it's not natural anymore once it's been chemically treated, so you don't want to do that. And then last but not least, I know they say things like cow manure and chicken and duck manure make very good compost, but you don't want to be trying to compost your pets' manure. So dog poop, cat poop, all that stuff, that we're not composting those things. It can bring about disease. So just really quickly going over those things. We talked about what composting was, what you could and could not compost, and today we're going to talk about the timeline. So in short, the difference between hot and cold, it's the way that it's processed and the time that it takes. One way takes a couple of months and requires some maintenance. The other way takes 6 months to a year and requires little to no maintenance. And so we're going to get right into that. So when composting, we're going to talk about the size of the piles as well. An ideal pile is maybe 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. That would be like an ideal outsized compost pile. If you're getting a composting bin and you know how much waste and soil that you'll add to that waste for it to break down in whatever that size of that container is, you would compost to that. But if you're actually making a pile for yourself outside, if you're trying to do a composting pile, we want to first talk about the size of the pile, that it should be a 3 by 3 by 3, maybe a little larger. You need it to be shallow enough so that you can actually bury the materials that are going to be composted under the dirt, and that it is covered so that it has a chance to cook. Like Lorilla says, let it cook. You got to put that stuff down in that dirt so that it can cook, and it has to have some depth to it. So we want to make sure that when we're doing a composting pile, an ideal size of a composting pile would be about a 3 by 3 by 3. And that's on any size of your compost piles. You can have, like I said, a larger pile, but it may or may not be turned evenly. A smaller pile, your stuff probably is not going to compost as well because it doesn't have enough space to cook and do what it needs to do. So ideal pile size, 3 by 3. Timeline on composting. So like I said, we're going to get into what hot composting is and what cold composting is. But on hot composting, that timeline is going to be about 2 to 3 months from the time that you place those materials in the soil and bury them until they're fully composted. When we're doing the cold compost method, you will place the items in the ground for 6 to 12 months and do very little before you actually have a completed compost. Now, I know I said completed compost, and you mean, what do you mean by completed compost? That means that your pile has completely broken itself down. Now, after I explain hot and cold, we're also going to talk about some troubleshooting, because what if your organic materials didn't break down? What if you are seeing pests? If you did have a bad smell? We're going to cover those things in just a moment. But here is a quick conservation tip of the week. After this conservation tip, we're going to come back and we're going to go through what hot and cold composting is. Thank you for watching.
And here is your conservation tip of the week. Do your own conservation research. That's right, research. As of 2024, there are over 29,000 community gardens in the 100 largest cities across the United States. That number doesn't even account for smaller towns and rural areas, so the nationwide total is likely much higher. These gardens aren't just about growing veggies. They're hubs for fresh food access, neighborhood bonding, even boosting property values. In fact, proximity to a community garden can increase surrounding property values by up to 9.4%. Even better, it is a way to practice soil conservation. Do your research, find and visit a community garden near you. Hot versus cold composting.
Conservation tip. We try to give you good little nuggets that help you implement the conservation practice in your own everyday life in simple ways. And so we hope you appreciated that conservation tip for this week. Now, we're talking about composting and the process, and I said that we would go through and talk about the difference between hot and cold composting. So I may do just a little reading here so that I can make sure I don't just run off the top of mine and confuse you guys. But we're going to start with hot composting. Now, what is hot composting? Hot composting involves maintaining specific conditions like the temperature and moisture of the pile to ensure that it's properly decomposing. It is faster in decomposing. It heats up and it breaks things down quicker because of the heating element. Hot composting can produce unable compost in weeks or months if the temperatures are high and they accelerate the decomposition process, meaning that it goes too fast and it can make some really bad compost. So good composting, you're going to make sure that the temperature and conditions are right where you're putting your compost. You want to make sure composting does really, really well in dark spaces, and making sure that there is some shaded dark area so that stuff can go ahead and begin to break down. Think about, maybe this is a bad example, not necessarily moldy areas, but damp areas, making sure that that ground is damp. Dark places, when you do that, if you've ever seen something in the ground or accidentally left something in a dark space and it got wet, you see how it breaks down. So the temperature and the moisture are very important because you are burying these items underground. So you don't want to just bury them in some sand or something that's just dry. You want to make sure that it's a soil that is moist when you're adding the materials to it so that it can break down correctly, not too fast and not too slow. On your hot compost piles, your process is going to take you about 2 to 3 months. Now, when you're hot composting, it requires that you do a little bit of work. On the hot composting pile, and where's my note here? Okay, so you want to turn the pile, meaning that once you have buried your materials in the sand, you're going to still mix it up. It's still got to cook, let it cook. So every 1 to 2 weeks, during this 2 to 3 month process, you want to be mixing up that pile and making sure that stuff is breaking down. Not only that, so that you're mixing it up, you want to make sure that that pile stays moist. Imagine a wrung out sponge. You don't want it wet and sloppy. That's only going to produce mildew and bacteria. But you want it like how you would imagine a wrung out sponge. So you want to make sure that the soil is being turned or stirred up every 1 to 2 weeks. And you want to make sure that the moisture of the soil is like a wrung out sponge. And you'll do that for the course of the 2 to 3 months. And you'll know that your compost is ready when all of the dirt, all of that mixture, you don't see any more organic materials in it, maybe some earthworms. And it's going to be really dark and rich and crumbly and have this really beautiful earthy smell. And maybe all of you don't like that dirt earthy smell, but I love it. I love the smell of some really good earth. And so when hot composting, you're going to make sure that you are cognizant of the temperature and moisture of the soil, that you're turning the compost pile every 1 to 2 weeks, and that you're giving it about 2 to 3 months for the process. Hot composting is great because it does things that cold composting doesn't. Case in point, it kills weed seeds and pathogens. When you're using the hot composting, the high temperatures reached during that composting, when I said let it cook, it actually heats up that organic material heats up to such a temperature that it is killing any of the weed seeds or either harmful pathogens that could be present in some of the organic material. So hot composting is really great for getting rid of things that you don't want in your soil. Because it kills the weeds and the seeds, hot composting can handle materials a lot better than the cold composting. So case in point, I said at one point I was taking my diseased plants and putting them in the compost pile. Well, that particular pile that I had, I wasn't turning it, and it was more of a cold composting. It was in a bin, and my organic materials weren't breaking down as fast. And so those diseased plants only made a mess in that composting pile. In my hot composting pile, when I took extra leaves that might have had some bug bites or damage, they actually cooked down, and all of the pathogens or diseases that would have been on that unhealthy plant were basically cooked or heated out of the composting mix. So hot soil is great because it can handle some things that the cold composting can't. It also produces a higher quality and quantity of compost. Hot composting it is more uniform and nutrient rich once it's finished. It requires, like I said, a lot of soil, a lot more soil, and it requires that soil be maintained at a certain temperature and moisture range, but it does compost or decompose the organic materials faster. It does kill weed seeds and other pathogens and things like that. It may be able to withstand some of the things, like if you accidentally put an unhealthy plant in it, or if it is some dead or dried grass that you think maybe is not a healthy plant. Hot composting can handle that. So we're going to use hot composting, especially if we're going to use that compost mix because we have a plant coming up and we know that we're going to need to amend soil. So like on our community gardens, we do a winter plant and we do another plant in the spring. So for our winter compost, we want to do hot composting, and we want to make sure that we start that during the summer, somewhere June, July, so that we have a good 2-3 months before it's time for that compost to be used. So that's what we want to give you today on hot composting. Now on cold composting, it is a lot simpler. It's basically you're going to dump the stuff in the ground. You are not necessarily concerned about the temperature of the soil, and there's no turning. You're not having to go turn it every 1 to 2 weeks like you would with the hot composting. Because it's cold composting, it takes more than a year to produce usable compost. It's not going to kill weeds. It's not going to kill pathogens. So you got to be a lot more selective about what you add to the pile. We talked about what you can and can't compost. And some people, like in that list, I said don't add meat products and things like that. But like I said, you can do that type of composting where you use other materials, eggshells. Like I said, some people like to use fish because of what it produces in the composting in terms of nutrients. But when you're cold composting, you have to be very selective about the materials that you're using because it's not going to be heated up. That material isn't going to decompose fast and heat up to a temperature where it's killing off pathogens. So it may or may not kill weed seeds, but more than likely it's not going to reach a high enough temperature to do so. Cold composting is really just best for smaller gardens or if you don't have a lot of time or space for composting. So some of you people were talking now about composting and you may not be overly excited about it. So you may just get a small composting bin in your home and line it with a dark liner and leave it in there. Not adding it into any soil or anything of that nature. That's going to be what you would call like your cold composting. It's a good soil conditioner. And with that cold compost, it's really good for like trees and orchids, and things like that where you have citrus and fruits and stuff like that. It will produce a less uniform textured compost, and it will oftentimes still have some of the materials not be all the way decomposed even after that year because the soil isn't heating up. So you can use cold composting if you don't have a large area to create a pile that you can turn and heat and stir up those materials. If you're going to just maybe leave it in a bag in a dark space somewhere, and you're not having a space, maybe a 3x3x3 space where you can actually make the compost pile, the composting pile, that cold composting method may be the one for you. If you do have an outside garden where you have 3x3 space or a backyard or on your farm, you're going to probably want to do the hot decomposition method, and you're going to get it faster, better quality. So that's your hot versus cold. We're learning that with the hot, I'm going to get it faster, but I got to get out there and use my arms to shovel and turn and mix it up. With the cold composting, I'm going to just put it somewhere dark away and let it do its thing for about a year, and I may or may not have all of my materials decomposed. It may or may not kill out weed seeds or pathogens. So if I had to say hot versus cold, I'd want to be hot. But for those, like I said, if you don't have the space or the time to tend to it, there is another way that you can practice composting, and that is through doing the cold composting method. So now we know that there's a difference between hot and cold. We can kind of consider, am I going to really get into this and put in the time and the effort to do a hot compost pile? Or am I just wanting to do my part with minimal effort and I don't want to turn anything, do all of that? So I would go the cold composting method. Now, like I said, we want to talk about troubleshooting, because with the differences in composting, how do I know if my compost is good? How do I know if I put something in there bad? Or how do I know if I've messed it up? So here's a couple of things with the troubleshooting on the compost. If you are composting and you say it does produce a bad smell, it smells bad, and you're not using meat products or fish or anything like that, then what it could be your problem is that your soil is too wet. If your soil is too wet, it's going to create more of a sludge, not really a compost, and it will produce a smell. As well, if you have too many green items in your compost. Remember, our green items are nitrogen rich, and that nitrogen and that smell that you're going to get from that, if it's too many greens, that could be an issue. And so if you check out the video that we talked about on last week, one of the tips was watch what you're composting in that. It should look like a great dinner plate with a variety of colors and things of that nature. Nobody wants a bland dinner plate. You don't want bland compost. Too many greens can produce a odor. Okay, your pile not breaking down. So you've composted and you said, oh, this is just not breaking down. It's not going anywhere. Then in that particular instant, if it's not breaking down, then it could be that it is too dry. Your soil is too dry to start the decomposition of the organic materials. Or you could have not enough greens. So if it's not breaking down, it may not have enough of the nitrogen-rich materials that are used in composting. So again, you want to watch what you're putting in the ground. If you watch our previous video, it really went into some depth about what your composting should look like in terms of colors. If you're finding that pests, if you're finding that composting is bringing pests, and I'm not talking about earthworms. We want our compost to have earthworms. So when you start seeing a bunch of earthworms in the compost, those aren't pests, those are our friends. They help the decomposition process. But if you find other pests, ants or whatever, what you're going to want to do is add more browns, and you're going to want to bury the food scraps deeper. So that's why when we talked about that 3x3 pile having a depth of about 3 feet for you to be able to plant those materials in, that helps to keep pests from smelling it or digging it up or things of that nature, or creating other pests, like I said, ants, other insects that we may not want to be in our composting piles. Once you've gone through the composting process, you've taken 2 to 3 months, and you have made some really good, beautiful, dark, rich compost, and you're ready to use it, you can use it on a variety of things in your garden. It's just not for planting foods. You can use it in your garden beds, in your potted plants. You can use it as a lawn top dressing. And like I said, we practice or we're participating in community gardens. Community gardens love compost. So if you're deciding that you want to help reduce your carbon footprint and assist in the soil conservation efforts by composting, and you don't have anything to do with your compost, by all means, look up your local community gardens or share it with neighbors who may be gardening. They will thank you for it. Compost is literally black gold. It is gold for your garden. So make sure that if you get into composting and you don't know what to do with it, that you just don't throw it away. It can be used. It is gold, and there's somebody out there that will thank you for it. Now, we know that composting is more than just playing in the dirt and burying food scraps. It really is a way to help with soil conservation. Not only does it help with soil conservation, but recycling or scrapping those foods in that way reduces waste, and it helps to not create these huge, large landfills, because you're using that in another way, and it's actually breaking down. So I want to challenge all of you who have been watching the information that we've been sharing on composting to get out there and make you a small compost pile, or go and get you some dark bags or a small composting bin that you can place right there in your kitchen and start your own composting journey. If you're going to start a composting journey, I want you to leave a comment below, and I'm going to check in on you to see how you're doing. As well, on our next episode, since we've talked so much about it on the inside, we're going to do a live demo, and we'll actually be going over to a community garden to look at their composting pile that they started about 30 days ago so that we could see what it looks like on a hot compost pile. As well, we'll take a look at a few composting bins that are not using the hot method but the cold method so that you can see a live demo on both. I hope you learned so much today about composting. I hope you learned the difference between hot and cold. You've decided which method you want to try. If you need to know what materials you need to have in advance, like I said, check out our previous video where we have a supply list of what you'll need to start your composting journey. And we look so forward to seeing what you're able to produce through your soil conservation efforts. My name is Deidre Perry, and I will see you again on next week. Like I said, make sure, put this soil conservation education to practice right there in your own home. It's something wonderful to teach your kids. It's wonderful to do with seniors, to go out and just compost and garden. And we want to see what you're doing. Like I said, make sure that you like this video, that you share this video, and that you make sure you comment about your own composting journeys or tips that you may have for other people who want to be a soil conservation just like yourself. Until next week, I'm Deidre Perry, and this is the Soil Conservation Connection.
You are watching the Soil Conservation Connection only on We Believe Digital. If you are feeling our content, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to follow us on all social media.